Show the green.
Go!
On the night of June 5, 1944, each American paratrooper who climbed aboard a C-47 and flew toward Normandy was carrying between 90 and 150 pounds of gear: rifle, grenades, ammunition, explosives, rations, parachute, reserve chute, strapped and buckled and taped to his body until he could barely walk. Some men had to be lifted into the plane by their teammates. They would jump from 600 feet, barely high enough for the parachute to fully deploy, into total darkness, over a peninsula the Germans had deliberately flooded. Allied planners had run the numbers. Air Marshal Lee Mallory, the Allied air commander, had warned Eisenhower in writing that the operation could produce losses of roughly half the paratroopers and as many as 70% of the glider troops, what he described bluntly as the potential futile slaughter of two fine divisions. The Allied High Command looked at those numbers, accepted them, and authorized the mission anyway. By the end of June 6th, 2,499 of the 13,400 Americans who jumped had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. In the 82nd Airborne Division, 15 of the 16 battalion commanders in the infantry regiments were killed or wounded on that single day. After 24 hours, divisional headquarters could account for barely 1/3 of the men who had jumped. What the history books don't always tell you, and what the men who survived those fields almost never talked about, is the specific nature of what those first hours actually looked like. Not the strategic success, not the flags planted and the towns liberated, what it cost the men who had no choice but to jump anyway. The plan was meticulous. 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop into the Cotentin Peninsula starting around 1 o'clock in the morning, 5 hours before the beach landings. Their job? Seize the causeways off Utah Beach, secure the road junctions, neutralize German artillery positions, and prevent German armored units from reaching the coast and crushing the amphibious force before it could get off the sand. If the paratroopers failed, the men waiting ashore at Utah Beach could be pinned and destroyed on the beach itself. The 82nd would drop inland, west of the Murderay River, and hold the western approaches. The 101st would take the coastal causeways. Both divisions had trained for this mission. They knew their objectives by name and by map coordinate. The plan, on paper, was sound. There were 3 problems the plan could not fully account for. The first was the cloud cover. A massive bank of cloud had built over the Cotentin Peninsula, thick enough that pilots couldn't see ground landmarks, couldn't hold formation, and in many cases couldn't identify their drop zones from the air. The order was to drop on schedule regardless. The second was the flak. German anti-aircraft batteries opened up with everything they had. Planes dove, climbed, and scattered to avoid being shot out of the sky. Many pilots hit the green jump light early, some miles before reaching the drop zones, because they were taking hits and needed their men off the aircraft before the plane went down. Paratroopers jumped into the darkness not knowing whether they were 5 miles or 15 miles from where they were supposed to be. The third problem was the water. The Germans had opened the locks at Carentan at high tide weeks earlier, flooding hundreds of acres of the Cotentin lowlands. Tufts of grass still showed above the surface, so reconnaissance aircraft had not detected the full extent of the flooding. Maps showed dry fields. The men who landed in those fields found themselves in water, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes chest deep, sometimes over their heads. The parachute harness had no quick-release mechanism. A man going into deep water had to unfasten it buckle by buckle, in the dark, while the weight of everything he carried pulled him toward the bottom. At 1:40 in the morning, the first paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment began dropping on Sainte-Mère-Église. They were not supposed to drop there. A house on the edge of the town square had been set ablaze by a stray Allied incendiary bomb dropped earlier that night. The fire had drawn the entire village, townspeople, German garrison soldiers, into the square to fight it. The square was lit up. German soldiers were already in the streets, already armed, already looking up when the C-47s came over. Paratroopers from 2 aircraft dropped directly into the lit town square. Silhouetted against the night sky, descending at roughly 10 to 12 feet per second, they could not maneuver, could not fight back, and could not stop. German soldiers shot them while they were still in the air. Several men were killed before they reached the ground. Others were shot on landing, tangled in their parachutes, unable to get free in time. Private John Steele was hit by flak before he reached the ground. His parachute snagged on one of the spires of the 12th century church and left him suspended, wounded in the foot, unable to cut himself free because he had lost his knife on the way down. For 2 hours he hung there, playing dead, watching his fellow soldiers die in the square below him. The man who landed directly at his feet, Sergeant John Ray, was shot in the stomach by a German soldier within seconds of touching down. Around him, 12 men from his unit were killed, wounded, or captured in the square that night. He survived. Most of the others who fell into the lit square did not. The experience at Sainte-Mère-Église was the visible horror, the one with a face, with a name, with a church steeple that still carries a mannequin in Steele's honor. What happened in the dark fields outside the town was less visible and, in many ways, worse. Across the Cotentin Peninsula, paratroopers were coming down in every configuration the mind can produce. In hedgerow orchards, where the dense foliage caught their parachutes and left them suspended, thrashing in the dark. In flooded lowlands, where the weight of their equipment pulled them under before they could fight free of the harness. In 2 feet of standing water, in the dark, with 100 pounds of gear on your back and a parachute canopy spreading out across the surface above you, time was the thing you did not have. Dozens of men drowned in those fields that night. The Army's official figures were cautious about exact numbers, ranging from a few to scores. Veterans who survived described watching their comrades go under and not come back up. The Mer River, swollen to 3 or 4 times its normal width, claimed men whose only mistake was landing 200 yards left of their assigned drop zone. The 507th and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments of the 82nd had the worst of it. Only 25% of the 508th landed within a mile of their designated drop zone. Half the regiment came down east of the Mer, on the wrong side of the river, cut off from their objectives and isolated in enemy territory. After 24 hours, the 101st Airborne Division headquarters could account for fewer than half its men. Only 1/6 of the 101st paratroopers reached their designated assembly points. This is the detail that doesn't fit the popular image of D-Day. Not because the paratroopers failed. They didn't. They adapted in ways that defied what any planner had a right to expect. But the adaptation required each man to confront, alone or in tiny improvised groups, the specific horror of not knowing where he was, not knowing where his unit was, not knowing whether the men with him were from his regiment or a completely different division, in the dark, behind enemy lines, with German patrols moving through the same hedgerows. The bocage terrain, centuries-old hedge lines of thorn and timber rooted 5 feet deep along earthen embankments, divided the Cotentin Peninsula into sealed boxes. You could be 50 yards from another group of Americans and have no idea they existed. You could hear German voices in the field directly adjacent to yours and be unable to determine which direction they were moving. The crickets, small metal clickers the paratroopers carried to identify friend from foe, were the only way to know if the shape moving through a hedgerow was an ally or an enemy. 1 click, 2 clicks back. Nothing, and you were alone. Men who landed miles from their drop zones made their way through the darkness toward whatever objective seemed closest. Colonels assembled squads from 3 different regiments and led them on missions their original orders never contemplated. Privates found themselves the senior surviving soldier in their vicinity and made the decision to attack rather than wait for orders that weren't coming. Men from the 82nd led men from the 101st on missions neither regiment had been assigned. The only qualification for command in those first hours was that you were still standing and had some idea of which way was north. Some men roamed and fought behind German lines for up to 5 days before reaching friendly forces. Scores of men scattered without unit cohesion were, as the Air Force Historical Study would later put it, quickly mopped up by small German units that possessed the one thing the scattered Americans did not: coherence. Equipment bundles, the mortars, machine guns, radios, and anti-tank weapons that had been dropped separately in containers, were scattered across miles of flooded countryside. Entire platoons fought through the first day armed with nothing heavier than the rifles and grenades they had jumped with, because the containers carrying everything else were sitting in flooded fields they could not locate or reach. By the morning of June 6th, the question was not whether the airborne plan had gone as designed. It had not. The question was whether the men who survived the drop could do enough from wherever they had landed to keep the beach landing from failing. The 82nd Airborne spent 33 consecutive days in Normandy without relief and without replacements. By the time the division was finally pulled back to England in mid-July, it had suffered 46% casualties, 5,245 men killed, wounded, or missing. Major General Matthew Ridgway's post-battle report stated, 33 days of action without relief, without replacements. Every mission accomplished. No ground gained was ever relinquished. The 101st fared similarly. By June 30th, the division had taken 4,670 casualties. Lee Mallory had committed his warning to writing. Eisenhower overruled him twice, accepted the risk, and reportedly wept when the last plane had gone. The men who climbed aboard did not know the precise casualty projections. They knew what paratroopers always know before a combat jump, that the mission was dangerous and that some of them would not come back. They adjusted their equipment, checked their harnesses, and waited for the green light. There was no version of this mission that the men at the top believed would be anything other than catastrophic. The question was only whether the catastrophe would be sufficient to keep the amphibious force alive long enough to win. That was the wager, and it was made with the lives of 13,400 men who had volunteered to be paratroopers because they believed in something larger than their own survival. What they found when they jumped was not the clean, operational narrative of a mission with drop zones and phase lines and coordinated attacks. What they found was the flooded dark, the wrong field, the harness that wouldn't release, the hedgerow that sealed them in, the shape moving through the grass that might be an ally or might not. They found it alone, or nearly alone, with their orientation equipment scattered in the drop and their unit gone somewhere into the Normandy night. And most of them fought anyway. Not because the plan was working, it wasn't, because there was nothing else to do, and because Utah Beach was out there somewhere, and the men coming off that beach needed someone to have already cleared the road. The monument at Sainte-Mère-Église still has the mannequin hanging from the church spire. John Steele's effigy, suspended above the square, parachute tangled in the stonework where the real man hung for 2 hours in the dark, with a wounded foot and a dead sergeant at his feet. It is a strange monument, a frozen horror rather than a triumph. And that is probably appropriate, because the Normandy airborne operation was both of those things simultaneously. A tactical near disaster that accomplished its strategic objectives anyway, at a cost that the men who planned it had already accepted as inevitable before the first plane left England. The 82nd's record from those 33 days is not written on the monument. It's in Ridgway's after-action report. 33 days without relief, without replacements, every mission accomplished, no ground relinquished. 6 words that compress an accounting that would take a lifetime to fully absorb. The men who came down in those dark, flooded fields on the morning of June 6, 1944, the ones who made it and the ones who didn't, were not following a plan. The plan had come apart before they hit the ground. They were fighting with what they had, in the field where they landed, toward a beach they could not see, for men they had never met. That is what D-Day cost before a single American soldier set foot on the sand. If that's the kind of history you're here for, the men behind the monuments, The price behind the victory? Subscribe. There's more coming.